Good morning. Today the reading comes from Luke 21 verses 5 to 19. When some were speaking about the temple, how it was adorned with beautiful stones and gifts dedicated to God, he said, "As for these things that you see, the days will come when not one stone will be left upon another, all will be thrown down." They asked him, "Teacher, when will this be? And what will be the sign that this is about to take place?" And he said, "Beware that you are not led astray, for many will come in my name and say, 'I am he,' and 'the time is near.' Do not go after them. When you hear of wars and insurrections, do not be terrified, for these things must take place first, but the end will not follow immediately." Then he said to them, "Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be great earthquakes, and in various places famines and plagues, and there will be dreadful portents and great signs from heaven. But before all this occurs, they will arrest and persecute you. They will hand you over to synagogues and prisons, and you will be brought before kings and governors because of my name. This will give you an opportunity to testify. So make up your minds not to prepare your defence in advance, for I will give you words and a wisdom that none of your opponents will be able to withstand or contradict. You will be betrayed even by parents and brothers, by relatives and friends, and they will put some of you to death. You will be hated by all because of my name, but not a hair of your head will perish. By your endurance you will gain your souls." In this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Thank you, Dawn. Great words of hope this morning, aren't they? Hey? We're coming close to the end. In fact, this is the second last week in our Christian calendar year, and this is the second last reading we have from Luke, and it's an interesting place to almost finish. I rather suspect there have been many, well, I know there have been many times, and I've encountered a number of people in my walk as a person, as a minister, as a Christian, many people who have tried to tell me we're in end times and it's all about to happen and Jesus is going to return and there's going to be some violent and bloody overthrow and, the way of the world will be gone and the end times is an interesting and often a fixated topic for some people. There's no doubt, though, that we are in difficult times. And I rather suspect that most times in our history there would be people who would say we're in difficult times. There are a number of things in today's passage which would be easy to point to for me to put the fear of God into you, that we're either in difficult times or end times and now's the time to turn around and, if I was a good minister, that's what I'd do. But I'm not a good minister. I don't like using fear or guilt. There's a number of things, though, in today's passage which point us, that resonate for us. Nations rising against nations. And gosh, aren't we seeing that happening pointlessly at the moment? War, earthquakes, famine, the word plagues. Oh gosh, haven't we just that should have resonated in one way or another for all of us? Pestilence, yes. Signs from the heavens. Well, we had a red moon this week. And imagine if you're going back 2,000 years ago. I'm sure that wouldn't have been the first time there's been a red moon. But imagine if you're going back 2,000 years ago and didn't understand the heavens the way we do now. Gosh, a red moon would have scared the life out of you, wouldn't it? But there are a number of other systems that are currently under stress, that are currently in some ways falling down around us a bit at the moment. I don't know enough about this to talk too much on it, but had half an ear on the news yesterday to hear that some massive big cryptocurrency company went into bankruptcy. And there'll be a number of people, there's a whole range of things like that. I mean, people talk about talking about financial systems. I mean, people talk about the Great Wall Street crash of the 30s. But I mean, I've been through two kind of what they call, or maybe even three, sort of massive crashes in my lifetime now. And they seem to be coming more quickly and with very quite devastating effects. Our environment, the earth, is screaming at us. Help. We could add to famine and plagues, we could easily add firestorms, flood, rain events that have never been, even if it's not flood, it's, like the rain into amounts that are devastating. I mean, Mother Earth is crying to us. And I rather suspect for Jesus to have said the same things, say the things that he's quoted as saying in the book of Luke, he too would have lived through some difficult times to do with environment, to do with finances, to do with social structure, to do with plagues, health, all that kind of stuff. What I'm trying to say here is that there have been difficult times right through time. Jesus' time, our time, there's always been times of instability. And it would be easy to point to those signs and say the end is nigh. But if you notice in the passage, when Jesus is asked about what will the signs be, he actually avoids the question. He goes on to say there's going to be people who are going to come in my name and are going to talk with some sort of certainty about things. Well, don't listen to them. I'm listening to that. I've got to cycle home today, so I'm listening to that. And I think probably there are a number of different responses that go on in our world. And I've heard it, Christians we have our own kind of different responses. People of faith have our own little different responses to difficult times, to life circumstances. And I mean, back in the 1930s, since the 1930s, we sort of lived with this fight or flight response. You either have a fight or flight response. And I actually want to add a bit to that, because I think for quite a while, I kind of thought that the flight response was to run away and the fight response was to put your fists up. But I don't hear Jesus saying either of those things in what he says today when you are facing difficult times. It's not a time for fists. It's also not a time for running away. It's not a time for burying our head in the sand. The different kind of responses, I want to throw a couple of other ones at us. We live in a world where a lot of people are ignoring sometimes it's for their own benefit or their own selfish interest, just ignore the signs about how bad things are for others or for the earth. Business as usual. There's a great song that I really love by a musician by the name of Mose Allen, and it's covered by Elvis Costello, and the song's called Everybody's Crying Mercy. And in it is this line that says, everybody's crying mercy just as long as there's business first. And we keep going down that pathway where business runs our lives and government kowtow to business. Nothing to see here. I tell this story. When I was about 18, 19, I inherited my father's work car. It was a little Corolla panel van. He used to do mobile car tuning, and I inherited his work van. And And so I used to drive the vehicle around. And I was 18, 19. I gave it a bit of a thrashing. I really didn't care too much about the vehicle. My father, being a motor mechanic, every so often would service the car. And I remember him saying to me once that, look, I don't even know what it was. It was, the Johnson rod, or there is no Johnson rod in a car, just in case. Or maybe it was the rotating disconfibulatory upright belt. I don't know. There was something in the car that I'd done a fair bit of damage to and I'd just been ignoring, you know what I mean? Like I'd just been driving probably a little too fast and a little too... I'm not advocating for that. I'm not defending it. I was driving a little too fast, a little too quick around the corners. There's a story in my family which I've only just started to tell because I think I've got a moratorium on confession, that I once drove over a silent cop and put a massive big dent in the sump, the oil sump, and my dad saying to me, kind of like, how did that happen? When he was under the car, and I said, oh, I don't know, I don't remember. Oh, I remember. But anyway, so there's this massive noise coming from the car, probably, I don't know, and Dad's saying to me, why haven't you spoken to me about this thing in the car? It's making this noise. And I think my joking response, which went down like a lead balloon, was, oh, look, I just turned the radio up. I couldn't hear it. And that's how we're living life, a lot of us. We've got the radio turned up. The car's a mess, but we've got the radio turned up. It's going to be okay, Jack. Don't worry about it. Everything's fine. Pardon, sorry? Until the wheels fall off, until you come to a grinding halt. That's right. Look, I think there's another way as well of dealing with this, and this is what when I read Jesus, this is the way I would suggest that it comes out of today's passage to some extent. And I'm gathering a few things that Jesus has said, but there is a couple of lines in what Jesus says today which always draw me to this response in difficult times. Not just difficult times for me personally, but if you are having difficult times personally, this might hold for you as well. But when we're in difficult times as a community, as a church, as a world, what I hear from Jesus today is this idea of endurance, which I take to mean, when it comes out of Jesus' mouth, something along the lines of confronting and resisting. Which is not put your fists up, it's actually put your arms out. That's what I hear Jesus calling us to today. It's what I hear Jesus calling his followers to 2,000 years ago. This sense of life will be difficult, life will be tough. You are not going to be able to offer much if your voice becomes a loud screaming horn, air horn, or a clanging gong, as Paul put it. You're not going to be able to offer much into difficult times if you panic. You're not going to be able to offer much into difficult times if you react in anger, in frustration. You're not going to be able to offer much into difficult times if, in the face of other people's struggle, all you can do is scream or cry or yell. Jesus offers us this pathway. In the midst of difficulty and uncertainty and turmoil and pain, is to endure. To resist, to confront. If I could find other words for it, I'd say to hold firm. Find your anchor points. Know what you're here for. And stay true to that. Now, many people don't really know what they're here for because we've been listening to the voice of business and we've learned, or beauty, or we've learned to measure who we are based on how good looking we are or how fit we are, or we've learned to measure ourselves by how much we can buy and consume or sell. We've learned to measure ourselves by how we compete with somebody else. We've learned to try and find our place in life by how we compare to others. I think Jesus always knew that Christianity was going to be a small resilient movement on the edges for those who chose to follow, take that pathway. Our voice is always going to be different. But we have to still hold firm to it because it's a countercultural word, the word we share. The people we are called to be stand firm and is countercultural to the way of our world. Know your anchor points. Now, Jesus talks about in this passage today that what we're going to have in times, difficult times, words and wisdom. It feels a bit like reaching into the cornflakes pack for the prize. You know when you used to get a toy or something in your cornflakes pack, and what you pull out is words and wisdom. Woohoo! Fantastic. What on earth does that mean? I think what Jesus is trying to say here to us is in the midst of all that's difficult, either for yourself or if you've got the eyes to see and the ears to hear and the heart to follow for those for whom life is difficult, and if you're prepared to stand up on behalf of others, what Jesus is saying here is that in times of difficulty, your anchor points will give you the words. Your anchor points will help you to take the wisdom. Now remember, wisdom isn't just about it's not about how smart you are. Wisdom is how you apply the knowledge you've learnt from your experience. Can we be a calm but firm and courageous voice in the midst of the turmoil of our world? And if so, what does that voice sound like? What are our anchor points? Whenever we find ourselves in an argument, whenever we find ourselves watching greed take over, whenever we find ourselves in places where people are lost, what are our anchor points? What do we come back to? Now, I can share with you my set. You do quite regularly, actually, so you're probably getting tired of them. I'm sorry if that's the case, but I really do think these are ways. This is kind of wisdom in the midst. This is the wisdom of Jesus to us. That finding our way of love when the world is in turmoil. Actually listening to the compassion in our hearts and acting from that space is wisdom. Generosity is another anchor point of the faith. Being open to the idea that we're not the highest unit in the universe is so countercultural these days. But actually recognising that we're part of something bigger is a countercultural thing. Grace, mercy, inclusion. These are all anchor points. Gratitude, justice for the earth, for people. Forming community when people are being isolated off, singled out, is a countercultural and yet I think rather a way of resisting the way of our world, the way of enduring, the way almost to flourish when everything else around us is falling apart. So friends, we're heading into Christmas, which is more of a time of hope. And gosh, don't we need a little bit of hope? And that'll be the messages over the coming weeks. But today, I want us to remember that in these difficult times, Jesus is calling us to resist and to endure. To resist becoming another panic-driven, panic-filled voice, to not being a voice that screams guilt or fear or scarcity We're being called to resist the world as it is. I was having this conversation with Wenchen a couple of weeks ago after one of my sermons about how do we turn the river around? And I pointed out to him there's a great song, again by one of my favourite artists, Elvis Costello, a song called What Do We Have to Do to Turn the River in Reverse? And in many ways the reality is we won't turn the river in reverse. It's a flood. But if we're people of the faith, we don't go with the flood. We don't go with the rushing stream going in one direction, sending us all off into difficult times, more difficult times. We're turned to call and face and resist. And that's what I hear Jesus saying to us today. Resist. Resist the world the way that the world is. Don't turn your radio up to the point you can't see or hear. Stop and turn and resist the flood coming our way. Know your anchor points in the faith. Like I'm using that, you might want more spiritual language around it than I use. What are your values? What are your theological values? Who do you understand God to be that you want to live out in the world? What are your Christian ethics? What is it you want to do? What are your Christian morals that you want to live out in the face of difficult times? Think about those, because that's your way of resistance. It's your way of enduring. Be who you are called to be as God's person, as God's people, as God's church. Be who we are called to be. When everything else around us is difficult, be who we're called to be, which is God's people of love in the world. Let's not ever give up on that. That's our way of resistance. It's our way of endurance. It's the way, as Jesus says in today's passage, it's the way you find your soul. It's the way you find your soul. Amen.